Hi, I'm Jan Johnson, and I'm here to talk about using extra-canonical Jewish books in the study of the New Testament. For hundreds of years before the life of Jesus, Jewish writers were producing literature that did not become included in the canon, but are nevertheless highly significant and influential. These many writings illuminate the culture and political environment in which Jesus and the early church ministered. And as Daniel Harrington observes, quote, these provide a theological bridge between the testaments, unquote. These books come from around the 4th century BCE through the 1st century CE and were produced in a variety of locations, including the land of Israel and throughout the diaspora. For students in the New Testament, study of this literature can illuminate and deepen the understanding of the biblical text. Richard Bauckham, from our text, Hearing the New Testament, notes that, quote, even a small degree of first-hand acquaintance with the Jewish text will make a considerable difference to students' appreciation of references and parallels within the New Testament writings, unquote. And in our introduction to the New Testament text, De Silva also observes that these books are written, quote, by pious Jews seeking to make sense of their experiences and to discover how to remain faithful to God in a changing world, unquote. And as such, these provide insight and value to us today. Bauckham observes that the New Testament has been demonstrated as being thoroughly Jewish in nature through this intensive study of this Jewish material. Clearly, this literature is of significant value to a student of the New Testament. Now, this literature can be categorized in a variety of ways. De Silva observes that some of these books, such as 1st and 2nd Maccabees, are primarily historical. Others are wisdom literature, such as the Wisdom of Ben Sirah and the Wisdom of Solomon. Some of these books both have stories that both entertain and teach information about values, such as Tobit and Judith. And other books De Silva identifies more specifically, such as Baruch being a prophetic book and 2nd Esdras being an apocalypse. Finally, several books are expansions of existing Old Testament books. These include 1st Esdras, which is an expansion of Ezra and Nehemiah. Also, as Esther has expansions, and Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, Song of the Three Children, and Prayer of Manasseh are all expansions of the book of Daniel. Now, there is a specific subset of these books called the Apocrypha that have been debated throughout Christian history as to whether or not they should be part of the biblical canon. These books include the ones that are on the screen at the moment. Now, there are people that are proponents of including these books in the biblical canon. These include Augustine as one in the 5th century. He embraced the inclusion of these books as part of the biblical canon. The Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church today include these Apocrypha books as part of their biblical canon. And the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible includes these Apocrypha books, as well as Psalm 151 and 3rd and 4th Maccabees. There are also opponents of including these books as part of the canon. These believe that although these books have value to Christianity, they cannot be used for doctrine and should not be part of the canon. The Jewish people and the church fathers are among these groups who feel that although they're valuable, they shouldn't be part of the canon. Jerome, in the 4th century, quoted from the Apocrypha books and valued their content, but was very firm that these books could not be used to establish doctrine and thus should not be part of the canon. The Protestant reformers were likewise of the opinion that these books had value for learning and reading, but they could not be considered canon. For the reformers, the principle of sola scriptura required them to draw a strong distinction between what was considered scripture and thereby worthy for determining doctrine and what was not. Martin Luther, for example, agreed that these Jewish books were not to be considered canon. However, he included German versions of them in his German Bible translation. Now, De Silva notes that following the Reformation, publishers of Protestant Bibles began to exclude the Apocrypha books from the Bibles they produced, and over time, he says Protestants developed, quote, prejudice and contempt, unquote, for this literature. De Silva, however, defends the value of these books, stating that these books, quote, cannot fail to strengthen the faith both of Jews and Christians, unquote. A further list of these books is listed on the screen and will be in the discussion post as well. Now, the enormity of these extra-canonical Jewish literature books is substantial. Fully understanding this material requires not just reading it, but understanding it, each text in depth, to understand their historical, social, and theological settings, and this task can be daunting. Fortunately, however, many introductory and reference resources are available to assist in learning and understanding this material. This provides a starting place for new students of these books to begin their study of these books as how they relate to a particular passage. We are going to do that in regards to Romans 3:21 through 3:26. In this portion of Scripture, the Apostle Paul presents the concept that the righteousness of God is available, quote, through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. This is Romans, unquote. This is Romans 3:22 ESV version. This passage touches on the concept of propitiation, righteousness, and justification. Now, multiple extra-canonical Jewish books contain pertinent information regarding this portion of Scripture. Romans 3:21 states, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it." This passage is dealing with what we're interested in here is the phrase, the law and the prophets. Richard Longenecker observes that the phrase, the law and the prophets, is not used by Paul in other places in his epistles. He notes, however, that this phrase was, quote, commonly used in Jewish and Jewish Christian circles to refer to the Jewish Old Testament scriptures as a whole. As a whole is the part we're interested in. So similar usage can be observed in 2 Maccabees 15, verses 7 through 9. In that passage, Maccabeus is exhorting his troops not to fear. That's 2 Maccabees 15:8. And he does that by quote, encouraging them from the law and the prophets and reminding them also of the struggles they had won. That's 2 Maccabees 15:9. So he is using that term, the law and the prophets, and this helps illuminate that usage in Romans 3:21. This phrase is also used in 4 Maccabees 18:10. Where a mother reminds her sons of their father, saying, quote, while he was still with you, he taught you the law and the prophets. She then goes on in 4 Maccabees chapter 18, verses 11 through 19, to discuss stories from Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, a Psalm of David, and a proverb of Solomon. So clearly, scriptures from the law, the prophets, and the writings are all included in this passage under the phrase, the law and the prophets. So this certainly illuminates the usage of that term in Romans 3:21. Now, Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we're interested in this phrase, in this verse, in the phrase, the glory of God. Douglas Moo says to fall short of the glory of God means to fall away from the image of God in which human beings were first made. Moo also notes that a similar usage can be seen in the book, The Apocalypse of Moses, chapter 21, verse 6, where Adam, speaking to Eve upon eating the forbidden fruit, declares, O wicked woman, what have I done to you that you have deprived me of the glory of God? So Thomas Schreiner notes that in this passage of the Apocalypse of Moses 21:6, that Adam is blaming Eve for depriving him of the glory of God. And this clearly relates to Romans 3:23. Schreiner also notes that 3 Baruch chapter 4, verse 16 similarly declares that Adam was stripped of the glory of God. That passage reads, know therefore, O Baruch, that as Adam through this very tree obtained condemnation, so he sinned, and was divested of the glory of God, so also the men who now drink insatiably the wine which is begotten of it transgress worse than Adam. They also sin and are far from the glory of God. So these extra-canonical passages illuminate and add depth to the Romans 3:23 phrase, the glory of God. Now, Romans 3:25, in this passage, the apostle is discussing the redemptive work of Christ, exclaiming, quote, whom God put forth as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. Benjamin Ribbons discusses the concept of propitiation, noting that in 2nd and 4th Maccabees, martyr narratives are used to explain propitiation. So 4th Maccabees 17:21 through 22, for example, states that the tyrant, which is referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, was punished, and the homeland was purified, because they, that is the martyrs, having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation. So it's talking here about the martyrs having died, becoming a sin for the ransom for the sin of our nation. And through the blood of those devout ones and their death as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that had previously been mistreated. Schreiner says that this fourth Maccabean passage is, quote, a particularly illuminating parallel, unquote, to Romans 3:25. In this passage, the martyrs killed by Antiochus Epiphanes become an atoning sacrifice. Schreiner says that the blood of these that are called the devout ones in this passage and their deaths are an atoning sacrifice, and through that God delivers Israel. De Silva says that the author of 4th Maccabees interprets the martyr's death as a blood, quote, a blood sacrifice that atones for the sins of many, unquote. Jarvis Williams likewise says this same theme is present in 2nd Maccabees chapters 1 through 7. So both 2nd and 4th Maccabees, he states, quote, support that this salvation came by means of the martyr's violent death for sin, unquote. So these martyr passages in 2nd and 4th Maccabees therefore illuminate the concept of propitiation that's presented in Romans 3:25. So these few verses in Romans, scholars have found multiple parallels through the books of 2nd and 4th Maccabees, 3rd Baruch, and the Apocalypse of Moses. So the next step would be further study of these texts regarding these themes to become more acquainted and more familiar with the meaning. Now, Buckham notes that the study of these books adds depth to the New Testament study. That is the reason why we are interested in them. He says, the religious nature of much of this material provides insight to the religious dimension of the, quote, political, social, economic, and cultural life, unquote, of the ancient Jewish culture. So this is a strong reason why we're interested in this material. This material in turn eliminates the New Testament text. These books provide parallels to New Testament passages, but they also provide in-depth information about New Testament topics such as Herod, the Pharisees, marriage, and cultural values. Buckham also notes, however, that the study of these books can be difficult. There are many books which must be studied and researched to acquire a working knowledge of this material. Discerning correct dating, authorship, audience, and meaning can take much time. However, as previously noted, many resources regarding these books are now available to assist in gaining understanding of them and in providing a starting place for learning. Buckham also warns against the danger of parallelomania, in which a student only knows that these books through isolated passages rather than gaining an understanding of the entire book. An additional issue De Silva adds is that even with a thorough knowledge of these texts, it is, quote, impossible to prove that a New Testament author is drawing directly from an apocryphal book itself, unquote. Nevertheless, Buckham adds, New Testament students, quote, should not be deterred from reading Jewish texts of the period along with the excellent introductory material now available, unquote. So in conclusion, I have two concluding observations. First, Buckham observes that, quote, it would be a mistake to wait until one has mastered the broad picture, whether of early Judaism or of early Christianity's relation to Judaism, before studying the detailed ways in which Jewish texts can illuminate specific New Testament texts. So he is saying, in spite of the enormity of the task, get started with this learning through a particular Jewish book or a study of a subject related to a specific New Testament passage of interest, and growing this extra-canonical Jewish knowledge over time. It is a worthwhile pursuit. And secondly, finally, for Christians that study them, De Silva adds this, that these books demonstrate, quote, the zeal to walk faithfully before God in the face of adversity, the commitment to choose obedience to God over succumbing to the passions or weaknesses of the flesh, the experience of God's forgiveness, and expectations of God's perseverance, unquote. So these Jewish texts have much to offer us as Christians in our daily walk, in our pursuit of Christianity. These books, Silva concludes, have, quote, withstood the test of time, unquote. And as such, they deserve our attention, time, and study. Thank you very much for listening. God bless.